Hey, how's it going? In this video, I'm going to explain how I draw realistic texture. I'm going to talk about all the tools and the different techniques that I use, and all of the thoughts that go through my head when I'm trying to create realism. But before we get into that, if you're aiming for realism, you first need to understand the basics. And the two basics that are essential for every realistic piece, doesn't matter what it is, are form and values. Without those two fundamental building blocks, everything about a drawing just looks flat and boring. And without demonstrating form and value in your pieces, there's no point going to all the effort to create realistic texture if you do not have those two fundamentals down. To capture form and get like a real sense of volume in your work, you really need to understand values. These values are how light and dark a subject is. So the lights and the shadows. For me, the best way to do this and the best way to understand this is to work from a reference photo that has really dramatic lighting. Light coming from straight on from the front makes it very, very difficult to capture that form and volume. With my work, I try to pick a subject that has a single source of light coming from either side, to the left or the right. So one side of the subject is lit dramatically, kind of like I am here, and the other side is in a little bit more shadow, if not complete shadow. That creation of definite areas of light and shadow makes it so much easier to create form. And if I'm being honest, establishing those forms and using the correct values is way more important than any details that you're going to put in your pieces. But if you want to go into those details and you are trying to create a hyper-realistic or a photorealistic portrait or picture or whatever it is you're trying to draw, then having those definite areas of light and shadow is 100% going to make your job so much easier. Really, if you get the basic form right, you get those shadows and those lights in the right places, you could have a pretty much realistic piece without putting in any details. You don't need that texture for realism. But I am one of those people that loves to go into as much detail as possible, and if you're one of those people as well, you are probably going to want to learn how I put so much detail in my pieces. So let's talk about my process for adding detailed textures in artwork. And it doesn't matter what art that is, the process is pretty similar. I predominantly use charcoal, but these same techniques could be used with graphite. Heck, you could even transfer these techniques to paintings if you really want to. I know I do in my work. For this demonstration, I'm going to show you my process for using the charcoal on the elephant's tusk. This is so that I can demonstrate to you that this process can be applied to any surface or any texture. I start my realistic drawings by blocking in the basic underlying values using charcoal powder and a brush, keeping it very soft and not pressing too hard. Once those basic blocking values have been established, I start to work over the top with a charcoal pencil or a charcoal stick. I'm only pressing very lightly. I don't want it to be the darkest dark yet, and I'm just using these slightly darker marks to add a little bit more texture to those values. I'm only pressing lightly with the pencils because I want to be able to knock them back. I want to be able to blend them into the charcoal underneath, and I do this using a blending stump or sometimes the brush. For this piece, I am predominantly using a brush because I do want it to be really soft. I don't want to be scrubbing that charcoal into the surface. I want to be able to erase it really easily. Like, that is one thing that I've learned through 10-15 years of drawing with charcoal, is that you do need to be patient. You don't want to press too hard, and you don't want to put too much pressure on that paper. The less pressure that you put on that paper, and the less you're like scrubbing into that paper, the easier it is to erase, the easier it is to bring back your highlights, and it just makes the whole process significantly faster. So make sure you're building up your form, your shadows, really slowly with multiple layers. I don't want loads of harsh lines in my textures. I want subtle transitions pretty much all throughout my piece. So the darker marks need to be blended and made a little bit lighter by using this technique. I then use a putty eraser to start to bring out some of the highlights, and again using that putty eraser to add some of the texture to the part of the subject that I'm trying to draw, this time the lighter sections. I'm always thinking about the direction of light. If the light is coming from the left-hand side, then that putty eraser is going to be used on the left-hand side of the part of the drawing that I'm doing. So, for example, any raised surfaces on that texture that I'm trying to draw, the light is also going to hit those surfaces on the left-hand side. Once I've got those basic lights in, I will then knock them back just in the same way as the shadows before, using a brush or that blending stump. Again, I don't want everything to be super sharp, so I need to soften things and blend them together. Then more shadows can be added using the charcoal pencil. Again, following that principle, if the light is coming from the left-hand side, the shadows are going to be on the right-hand side. There is one exception to that though. I use a Tombow mono eraser, a really fine detailed eraser, to bring out some brighter highlights. Again, I'm looking at the left-hand side for any raised surfaces, but for any surfaces that are indented, like crevices or wrinkles, the light hits them slightly differently. If it's coming from the left-hand side, it's the right-hand side of those indented surfaces that the light will hit. The shadows will be on the left-hand side. So I'm always thinking about that when I'm doing my drawings. For the final little details, I go back to using that charcoal pencil, the brush, and a Derwent electric eraser to bring out the final brightest highlights. This Derwent eraser is absolutely fantastic and is an essential part of my charcoal toolkit. I have a video talking more about that, which I will leave a link to at the end of the video. Now that we've added all of those details, there is a massive trap that I do not want you to fall into. It's really easy to do this, and I am guilty of doing this all of the time, but it actually ruins pictures. Just don't go overboard. You do not need details everywhere. Do not overdo it. I know how difficult it is to resist the urge to just get carried away and stuck into details. If you're like me, you just get lost in those details. I just get stuck in my own little world, like tongue out, just really engaged in what I'm doing, hyper-focused, and sometimes that can lead to overworking a piece. And if you overwork a piece with too many details, that piece can end up looking flat again. And you've gone through hours and hours and hours of adding all those tiny details, you've got your form right, you've got your volume right, but because you've overworked those details, it just looks flat and boring again. Everything is just exactly the same, and there's no variation, and there's no interest, and there's no areas of the painting that gets the viewer's brain to work and engages the viewer's brain. There's a really delicate balance between detail and too much detail. With most textures, whether it's fur, whether it's skin, whether it's feathers, whether it's metal, wood, whatever it is you're trying to paint or draw, less is more. That is a rule to live by with all of your artworks. Less is more. Even with super hyper-realistic pieces, there are aspects of those pieces that have little to no details in them. Rather than over-sharpen everything, it is much better to soften some areas, to suggest detail and make the viewer's brain work to fill in the rest. So the areas like your focal points, the areas like eyes, the areas that you want your viewer to look at first, they can be super sharp and super detailed. The areas around that focal point want to be less sharp, less detailed, practically no detail, so that the viewer's brain is active in filling in those details for the viewer, thereby engaging that viewer for longer. As a general rule for this, the darker areas, for me anyway, tend to have less detail than the lighter areas. Just because of the principles of how we see, we need light to see. So if there's more light, there's going to be more details. If there's less light, there's going to be less details. It's not always quite that simple though, but for the vast majority of drawings that I do tend to stick to that rule. And if there is one thing that you remember from this, remember that. True masters of realism don't draw every detail, and that is something that I see, drawing every detail is something that I see in a lot of beginners' work that are accomplished at those details and they're creating good work, but it's just a bit flat, it's a bit boring. The true masters create in a way that makes you believe that they've gone into lots of detail, when in reality they're just suggesting those details in certain places. And that is a skill that I am slowly starting to understand, and it is a skill that I do think everyone should try and master and work towards mastering. I think if you can comprehend the difference between the actual details and the areas that do not need as many details, it will take your paintings and your drawings to a completely new level. It will probably be the biggest jump in your artwork that you will see. I do actually have one final really cool trick that I apply to a lot of my drawings that will help with that idea of suggesting details. So don't tune out, make sure you stick around because this is a super important tip. And what's even better is this tip works for drawings, black and white, but it also works for paintings in colour, pastel, oil, acrylics, watercolours even, whatever you use, this tip is universal. It works for all of them. So remember that general rule of only adding the details in the lights and you can have less details in the shadows. Well, we can actually expand on that a little bit more, and we can go into that and think about it in a little bit more detail. Pardon the pun. Not actual detail, but we can focus on it a little bit more. We can take it a step further. Some of the most important parts of any drawing are the transitions between the lights and the mid-values, and then the mid-values to the darks. Those intermediate transitions are where you could be focusing your details, and that is then enough to allow the viewer's brain to engage and suggest the rest of the details for the viewer. Having those details where those transitions occur makes your brain fill in the rest. It fills in the lights, and it fills in the darks, and it fills in the midtones. When you do this, it gives the appearance that all of those values have detail. And that effect is amplified the further back you step away from the picture. That is also something that I've got to train myself to do a little bit more, is step back from the picture. If you've seen me paint, you know that I like to get quite close to my pictures and I'm there scribbling away and I don't really take in the whole picture. So I have that tendency to over-sharpen, to over-detail everything when I work that close. But if we take the time to step back, if we take the time to only put those details in those important transitional areas, the rest of it is just suggested detail. If you've got that detail in those two transitions, your brain will fill in the rest and create a more realistic final piece. And it's that, coupled with those realistic textures, coupled with that understanding of form and volume, that allows us to create realistic pieces that have realistic details and realistic textures. And yeah, so the overarching statement for this video is try and be a little bit more conscious about where you're putting details in your pictures, how you're putting those details in, and understand that not everything has to be super detailed. Sometimes better, more realistic pieces, those hyper-realistic pieces that you see on artists that you follow that have hundreds of thousands of followers because their pieces are like photographs, they don't have detail everywhere. They are suggesting that detail, and that's what you need to do too. If you'd like to see a little bit more of my charcoal work and learn loads more tips for realistic drawing, then check out this video, which is the first part in my 5-part video series all about these large charcoal drawings. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.